Okay, welcome to today's lesson on the judicial branch. Let's start off with a question here. What is the job of a judge? Take a few minutes, think about it. Now, the judicial branch is the law interpreting branch of government. That's really what we're focusing on today. So we've talked already about the legislative branch and the executive branch and what each of those did respectively with making laws and enforcing the laws. Now we're looking at interpreting the laws and figuring out whether or not they are broken, and also whether or not the laws themselves are legitimate or not, because that's also a very important role of the judicial branch that we will discuss in this lesson. Our target, the same as it's been all week, I can identify the key members and powers of the judicial branch. And really, when we think about the target here, what we're really looking for, the goal here is justice. And justice, as they say, is balance. So if you look here, we have the scale in our hands. And what is the scale? It's with crime and punishment. Bring us to this idea here of somebody's arrested. What would be an appropriate crime or punishment? Let's say that somebody gets caught speeding. I think we'd all agree that it's not appropriate to give them the death penalty for that. And also, here's our other random target that doesn't really fit very well. Our pitch and Super Wilson throwing a football far harder and actually breaking the tree. Okay, back on to things that really matter. Let's get focused here with the background. We've discussed this many times, but the Founding Fathers wanted to divide power, and they did it in many different ways. We have federalism, which means we're dividing powers between federal, state, and local governments. And then beyond that, with the separation of powers, which was the three branches of government, with the legislative being the lawmaking branch, the executive being the law enforcing branch, and the judicial being the law interpreting, the one that we're looking at now today. Let's talk a little bit about the judicial branch and what they do in general. And I think that many of you probably have a pretty strong understanding of this just because you've seen TV or movies before with judges and whatnot. But the main job of the judicial branch is to interpret laws. In other words, this is our courts. So an example would be, let's say that the police bring in a person who is found guilty or they believe is guilty of speeding. The judge is going to do a lot of different things. He's going to hear evidence about the case. They're going to look at the law and figure out if the law was really broken. And if it is broken, they want to interpret the law to figure out what treatment the person should get as it relates to punishments and other considerations potentially related to it as well. Some of you may think of Judge Judy as being your judge here, although I'll say Judge Judy is not really the same type of judge that we're talking about in a normal courtroom. Her role is very, very different. That kind of fits in with the whole TV thing. Now, onto the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest level in the judicial branch. There is a state Supreme Court and also a federal Supreme Court. What we're going to focus on today is the federal or United States Supreme Court. Justices, and that's what they're called, the judges, these justices have a lifelong term, which is really, really crazy when you think about it. And they're appointed by the president and approved by Congress. So, whenever a president is in office, if there is a new opening, whether it be because somebody retired, did something illegal and had to be impeached and forced out of their position, or I should really say impeachment is the accusation, but the actual removal comes later, or if the person actually dies in office, then it will create an opening and the president gets to select who they would like to fill that role. Now, this is a very, very important power that we'll discuss here very soon. However, keep in mind that they are they do need to receive approval from Congress for any appointments that they have to the Supreme Court. There actually aren't any official requirements that are written into the United States Constitution about Supreme Court justices, so theoretically it could be anybody off the street, though because we have that whole approved by Congress thing, as well as the fact that the president's not going to want to put, I wouldn't imagine at least, somebody who is really, really unprepared for this position into the position, the approval does protect us from that. The makeup of the Supreme Court is that we have 8 associate justices and 1 chief justice. The current chief justice is named John Roberts. So could we theoretically have Will Ferrell, this is Chaz Michael Michaels if you've ever seen Blades of Glory, but could we have Will Ferrell as a Supreme Court justice? According to limitations, we actually could, because there's nothing there that states that a Supreme Court justice has to have a certain background. However, I think that most people would agree that Will Ferrell as a Supreme Court justice seems like a little bit of a long shot given his background. Now, I mentioned the idea of a lifelong term. I want you to think about how significant it is whenever you're looking at all of the different justices on the Supreme Court and when they were nominated and took their position on the Supreme Court. We've got people ranging from a couple, I'm going to show you a second one here in a second, who were appointed by President Obama, current President Obama, and many from the past as well, going all the way back to Ronald Reagan in 1986. Now, what I want to point out to you right here is that this justice actually was nominated in 1975 and served all the way until 2010. And this justice's name is It's back. What's his name again? He's really important. Anyways, 1975 is when he took his position on the Supreme Court, and for 35 years he served until he was replaced in 2010. So in 2010 we got a new Supreme Court justice. So that is our current Supreme Court and who also nominated them. So keep in mind, even going back to 1986, that's still a very long time here. We're looking at a span of about 27 years in which these people have been filling this, or longer, depending on when you're watching the video. Now, the Chief Justice, as I mentioned, is right there, Mr. John Roberts. Let's talk a little bit about money here. Everybody seems to always want to know about what do people make in different positions in the government. John Roberts is at $217,400. The other justices in the Supreme Court are making $208,100. Think about like U.S. House Representatives, $223,500. Going down to, that's Senator versus $174,000 for senators, or for U.S. House Representatives, The President is currently making $400,000 per year. That is the paid salary that these individuals have. That actually is up. I remember whenever I was growing up here not too long ago, we talked about it being far less at between $200,000 and $300,000. Now, what is the real power of the United States Supreme Court? Why do we care? Why does it really matter? Because the truth is, it's extremely, extremely important. You know, when you think about somebody having 35 years and they can't be removed from their position on the Supreme Court, well, what does it really matter? What could they screw up? Well, let's talk about this. One of the really, really, really important powers of the United States Supreme Court is the power of judicial review. What this means is that they have the ability to review all laws and to determine whether or not they are legal according to the Constitution. So when the legislative branch passes a law, it has to actually follow the United States Constitution. It can't be any law that they would like. So given that most of you probably know that we have freedom of speech in America, if the United States Congress and the legislative branch wanted to pass a law that said you're not allowed to talk after 5 o'clock at night, well, that would be a violation of the First Amendment freedom of speech, which is a part of the United States Constitution. Therefore, when that law passed, if the president signed it into action, and somebody actually came to court being found guilty of breaking that law, the Supreme Court could review that law and determine that it violates the United States Constitution, which basically means that they've canceled out the law and it cannot take effect anymore. So the Supreme Court can check what the legislative branch is doing. That's an important thing to look at. So basically what they can do is they can overturn laws that were passed, even if it was passed in both houses in Congress and signed by the president. So the Supreme Court's kind of like the final stop there. In some instances, it almost seems like they can create new laws too. For instance, if you are arrested, and this comes back to the case of Miranda rights. If anybody's ever heard of your Miranda rights, you know, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to remain silent, you know, all those good things. Nonetheless, the reason that police officers are required to do that is because the Supreme Court ruled that if a police officer does not tell people of their rights, that they are actually violating the law and they're restricting them from having certain rights that are really important. And if they don't do that, then the police actually can't use any evidence to prove that somebody's guilty. Interesting thing to think about. There's actually one way the Supreme Court can be overruled, and I don't think I have this on a slide, so I just want to tell you about it really quickly. It's that they have to pass a new amendment. So the reason that this works is, and by the way, it's the legislative branch in conjunction with the states that creates amendments, and this is my great writing there. Don't you guys love that writing? Raise your hand if you love the writing. All right, now raise your hand if you raised your hand when you're on a video watching it. Yeah, gotcha. Anyways, so passing an amendment is not a very easy process, and it can be done by the legislative branch. I need to get 3/4 of the states to actually follow along with it. But the whole point is this. If a new amendment is passed, that's the only way that you can overturn a Supreme Court decision. And getting an amendment passed is extremely, extremely difficult. If you look at the history of our country, we've had very few passed, and that tells you something about it. So really the Supreme Court decisions are borderline final. Very hard to overcome them. For instance, with Dred Scott, this is a very famous Supreme Court case from the 1850s, and what was determined in this case is that slavery is allowed anywhere. Without any limitation. And this is actually one of the final events that led up to the Civil War. And what this did is it overturned every single state's law that had a law that said that you could not have slavery in their state. So any northern state that said that slavery was outlawed, it actually was null and void and couldn't take effect because the Supreme Court ruled that you can't take away slavery because the Constitution and the Founding Fathers originally intended for slavery to be a part of the society. So interesting to think about how powerful it can really be. And Miranda rights are referred to before as well. We'll talk about this more when we get into the Bill of Rights and certain amendments related to your rights as an accused criminal, which, by the way, there are tons of rights as accused criminals. Interesting to think about. Another power of the Supreme Court is that it is a court of appeals. If you're found guilty in any level court, local, state, federal, you have the ability to appeal your case, and that means to have it heard again by somebody else. Over the course of time, you can go through various levels, but the last stop is the Supreme Court of the United States. They're the final one. So if they say that you're guilty still, then you're still guilty, and you can't get around it. They hear very few cases, though, and there are 3 reasons that they might hear a case. So the first one is if they think that there's some sort of a conflict in terms of people don't understand what a law actually means, they will go and they will clear it up by looking at it. So it's like our Clearasil, right? There we go. You love it. Second, and I'll just read the exact wording and then I'll explain it. To correct an egregious departure from the accepted and usual course of judicial proceedings. In other words, if there is a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake made in the courts somehow, some way, the United States Supreme Court may look at it. This is a random baseball thing, but this guy blatantly is tagging everybody out and they're not on the base. Yeah, they were called safe a few years back in the baseball playoffs, and this was a big deal at the time. But the idea is this. If somebody screws up along the way somewhere, the United States Supreme Court can step in to fix it. And third, I'll read it and then explain it. To resolve an important question of a federal law or to expressly review a decision of a lower court that conflicts directly with a previous decision of the court. In other words, if the United States Supreme Court says that the law should be interpreted in a certain fashion, but a judge on a lower level court in a state and a local government just blatantly doesn't follow what the judge originally said from the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court will step in and say, no, that is not appropriate. That's not the way that this is supposed to be resolved. So it's kind of like a power struggle here. The Supreme Court always wins. In truth, though, only 1 out of every 70 cases that are brought to the Supreme Court are actually heard, so they hear very few, so they only pick the ones that are the most important. Another thing that's really important is that the Supreme Court is able to give opinions and dissents. In other words, they give explanations of court decisions. So at the end of their trials, they'll actually write up an explanation explaining why things were ruled on, and this kind of hints to everybody else what will actually happen if a similar case arises in the future. So it kind of sets precedent. In other words, in the Dred Scott case, they ruled that Dred Scott himself, that he was still a slave in this situation. And then they said beyond that, slavery was never supposed to be stopped anywhere. It's supposed to be a right. That's where that whole thing came from, which is going to theoretically make it so that slavery can occur anywhere. Now, how do the 3 branches work together? We have the legislative branch, which passes laws, like let's say this one for texting while driving. Then the executive branch enforces them, or I'm sorry, this is talking on the phone while driving, says, okay, you broke the law, I'm going to give you a citation. And then finally, they're going to have the judicial branch, which interprets it to figure out if the person is guilty and what the appropriate punishment is. So that's how this actually works. Now, you have a reading here on Miranda rights. I want you all to read through it here and see if you can understand how the Supreme Court came in and impacted this and made a very, very significant decision. Okay? I hope that was clear to you and that made sense. The end.
Yeah.